What's up, nerds and nerdettes and wee little nerdlings all? Welcome back. Big Johnny G from Two Gun Pixie Presents Legendary Gaming is giving you another lunchtime, daytime drop. How's it going, everyone? So I'm just decided to start using my lunchtimes to shoot off some little videos when I have some thoughts concerning certain things. And what I was thinking about today is my love of Dungeons and Dragons. And it goes back to the late 70s and has continued ever since. I can't get enough of this game. I think it's a great game. I think it's a fantastic game for bringing people together, people hanging out, people having a good time together, as well as building a sort of story, an ongoing campaign-style story. It is wonderful. It is great, and I can't get enough of the game, as I said. One thing I've noticed over the years, though, is there's been a lot of attempts, a lot of tries for board games, board game versions of Dungeons and Dragons, trying to capture the essence of it in a box. And over the years, like I said, there's been a lot of attempts going all the way back to the earliest days of TSR and the board game Dungeon. We have to say it like that, Dungeon, because it ends in an exclamation point, right? Which actually technically isn't a Dungeons and Dragons game. It's a fantasy-based game, and the original version, it was you could choose between a wizard, a hero, an elf, or a superhero. Nothing like a comic book. I guess that just meant like a champion. And there's been several versions out of it since, and even today now there's a new version of it out which tries to tie in a little bit more to Dungeons and Dragons, the actual game. But there's been a lot of attempts anyway over the years to try to capture it, and I just wanted to talk about that for a few minutes because I also love board games. As you guys know from watching my videos, how much I love that. So you would think that when the two come together, I would be in heaven. Actually, I haven't been. Not really. I think that the big problem in the games is that almost none of the games really do capture that feel of the role-playing game experience, which is what Dungeons and Dragons is all about. It's the first role-playing game really to hit it big. Gary Gygax literally changed the world more than most people actually realize with the invention of this game. So why are they having such a problem with taking that essence of what it truly is and putting it into a board game? Well, to discuss that, I'm going to have to go over what some of the board games over these years were, and I'm gonna start with what I think is actually the best of all the Dungeons and Dragons board games, and I say that the best because it does the probably the best job of capturing that whole RPG campaign experience. And unfortunately, it's a game that's not printed anymore. It was printed in the early 2000s by Hasbro, and it was coincided with the release of the third edition game, and that was called Dungeons and Dragons Fantasy Adventure Game. And it had 2 expansions for it before it ended, Eternal Winter and Forbidden Forest. And it used what at the time was the new iconic characters that were presented in the player's handbook, people like Redgar the Fighter. And it used those miniatures, and it was a tile-based game. You needed a dungeon master in it. You definitely needed somebody to set the game up and to run the game, and then you had the players that were going through it. That's why I think it's actually one of the best versions, the best possible compilations of Dungeons and Dragons in a box, in a board game, is because it really did bring, more than anything else I believe before or since, bring you that feel to your board game table of playing Dungeons and Dragons. But like I said, unfortunately, they only came out with 2 expansions, and the game is very hard to get your hands on right now. Besides that, probably the next best games are going to be the Wrath of Ashadalon, Castle Ravenloft, Legend of Drizzt, and Temple of Elemental Evil box games that they came out with. You can mix them and match them if you want. You can take the characters from one and use them in another game. You can use the cards from game to game. So it's extremely interchangeable, and that's a really good system. You don't need a dungeon master in that because you're fighting against the game's AI, which is good. It's not great, but you have to determine what the monsters are doing based on where they are on the board. The card will tell you what they do. But my biggest drawback for that game being a really good boxed version of Dungeons and Dragons is the simple fact that you only level up to level 2. And that really bothers me. because Dungeons and Dragons it's about leveling. It's about making your characters better, and keeping these characters going from one game to another, and that players get a connection to their character because of that. And that's where all the board games, not so much the fantasy adventure board game, but as far as these ones go, Wrath of Ashardalon, Castle Ravenloft, Legend of Drizzt, and Temple of Elemental Evil, they fall flat. They do. The games are fun. You should play them. If you like Dungeons and Dragons and you like fantasy board games, you should definitely play them, but it doesn't feel like Dungeons and Dragons other than name and some of the iconic characters they use, like Strahd von Zardovic or Drizzt. Otherwise, it doesn't feel like that at all. But they're still fun games, but I have a hard time putting them into the category of Dungeons and Dragons, like I said, other than names, you know? Now, a lot of people that are watching this right now, you're thinking to yourself, John, how can you say that? How can you say that there are no good Dungeons and Dragons games when there are games like Lords of Waterdeep? Lords of Waterdeep is fantastic. I love that game. That's actually the game that got me into worker placement style games and area control games. Before that, I really didn't care for them. And that game got me into it, and I love playing it. My 20-sided warriors, we love sitting down, throwing it on the table, and having a game of that with Scoundrels of Skullport. It is fun. It is a great game. But it doesn't feel like Dungeons and Dragons. Yeah, it does cover the Forgotten Realms, so anyone that's familiar with that campaign setting or has read any of the novels set in that world is going to enjoy it a lot more than me. I'm a Greyhawk guy, but it's still not what Dungeons and Dragons is supposed to be. It's still not, has nothing to do with character leveling. It's all the Machiavellian political movements behind the scene, which plays a big part in Forgotten Realm, in the novels and the modules as well. But it's not Dungeons and Dragons outside of its name. There's nothing about what D&D is supposed to be really involved in that game, no matter how fun it is, no matter how much I love playing that game. Two other games that fit into that same category, Tyrants of the Underdark and Assault of the Giants. Fantastically fun games, great area control games. They have combat in it, so it's not your typical area control game, you know, where if your opponent gets somewhere and that's a spot that you needed and you really wanted, that you're SOL. In these games, you can attack and you can take those spots by killing the person's worker that's there, or giant that's there, drow that's there, and taking that over. And that is a really interesting step going beyond area control, because now area control is also, matters for how long you can actually control that area before you get offed. And they're fun games. They're great games. Those are two games also. I think anyone that loves fantasy-based board games, whether you like Dungeons and Dragons or not, should definitely try those games out. They're going to be worth your time. But again, they're not Dungeons and Dragons in the total feel and the sense of what the heart of Dungeons and Dragons is supposed to be. Two other really, really fun games, Rock, Paper, Wizards. I've just dropped a few videos on that game. Hopefully you guys have watched them. And me and my 20-sided warriors, we loved them. We had a great time with both those games. In Rock, Paper, Wizards, it's very similar to Rock, Paper, Scissors, but you're casting spells and you need to manipulate your hand, and you gotta do all these hand symbols while you're casting the spells, and you gotta do it at the person you're casting at. And it's really, really fun. Infighting is a combination dice card game, light cards, mostly dice, but in the game you're using the cards for who you are and what your abilities are, what bystanders you have around you, as well as a few action cards where you can do things. But mainly you're rolling the dice to see what happens in a very similar setup, a very similar mechanism to Bang the Dice game. But it has a great feel of being in a fantasy sword and sorcery tavern in the middle of a bar fight, and it totally grabs that, and it totally feels it, and it's awesome, it's fun. But again, it's not Dungeons and Dragons. It has nothing to do with the heart and the soul of what D&D really is. This whole role-playing aspect and building the characters and having them go from one campaign to another and hoping they don't die because you spent so much time and energy in them. It lacks that. One game, again, another game, an older game that's not available anymore, that's really fun and probably comes also along with the Dungeons & Dragons Fantasy Adventure board game as being one of the best capture games for capturing the feel of it, is Dragonlance game, which was based on the Dragonlance novels, the original trilogy. and it's a great game. It's a combat game, and it has counters, almost like poker chips. So not only are you going around the table, but you're moving up and down, and your height and where you are. Because of that, all plays a part in how you're going to attack the other person, all trying to get the Dragon Lance and get it back to your base. And that felt great, because that really reminded me of the modules, but mostly of the novels that I had read, and it really sucked me in and brought me into that world even more. So that came really, really close, but there's no real characters. Yeah, you get to play, one of the characters like Tanis or Lord Soth, but that's it. And each have, like, I think they have one special ability, I think, if I remember correctly, that they can do. But other than that, there's no hit points, there's no advancement, there's no equipment really that you can get. Well, there's a couple of artifacts that you can find in the game. I think there's 3 or 4 artifacts that are hard to get if you make it into the castle. Make it into the castle instead of on top of the castle to grab the Dragon Lance. But it's so limited. It really is that you might as well not even consider it part of the game. But it did feel like a Dragonlance novel. It felt like the epic war for the Dragonlance itself. And off the top of my head, I can think of two other games that have the Dungeons and Dragons name, and that's well, the one I mentioned earlier to start this off with, Dungeon, is one of them. And again, like I said, the original Dungeon that was published by TSR, it wasn't a Dungeons and Dragons game. It was just a fantasy-based board game where you go through and you got to collect as much treasure as you can and get out. It had nothing to do with the rules of the game. The characters were almost completely different from what you would play in Dungeons and Dragons. So that is a fun game. It's great for families, great for kids, but it's not Dungeons and Dragons. And the other one is Three Dragon Ante. And then there's a sequel to it, Emperor's something, I can't remember. And those games, what they try to do is they try to combine the whole concept of a typical old-fashioned style card game, like five card stud, the poker kind of games, and incorporating that into a D&D world. Three Dragon Ante is supposed to be the card game played in Dungeons and Dragons, so it's kind of like metagaming in a sense. You're playing a game inside a game. And it was supposed to be used not just for tabletop use, but if your characters, you're playing the actual Dungeons and Dragons role-playing game, and your characters went into a tavern and they wanted to relax and they wanted to gamble, you could pull Three Dragon Ante off your shelf and sit down and deal cards with each other and play through it. So therefore, yes, it is Dungeons and Dragons, but it's really shoehorned into the whole world of D&D. So because of that, I don't even consider that a Dungeons and Dragons game. That's there with Dungeon with me, okay? But why? Why have they not really come out with a boxed board game that captures the essence, the feel, the heart and soul of what Dungeons and Dragons is? Other companies have done it, most notably Descent, especially now with which was a huge success, but even bigger success with their second edition, and they have a system where the characters are going to be able to get and keep treasure and magical items as you campaign through for days after days after days of playing, and your characters will continue and they'll get better and they'll get more equipment. And you see that same thing also in Star Wars Imperial Assault. You see that Shadows of Brimstone. Shadows of Brimstone is probably, I think, the best role-playing game, board game that I own and that I've played. It has actual levels that you're going to go up. You get abilities based on not only what archetype or class that you've taken, but just for general advancement in level as well. So you're going to be continuing getting better and more powerful, getting better skills, better abilities. So we see that there are other board games by other companies that are able to embrace the real heart and soul of what the Dungeons and Dragons role-playing game always has been. But for some reason, TSR and now Wizards of the Coast, they really seem to drop the ball on capturing that. They've come out with some great board games, but none of them are what Dungeons and Dragons is, an RPG. And I'm a little saddened by that because I love it so much. But anyway, this has all been on my mind because we're getting ready to start an actual D&D campaign with me and the 20-Sided Warriors soon. We haven't done one in a while, and we're going back to basics. So this has been on my mind. So if I've left out any Dungeons & Dragons titled board game, please make a note in the comments and let me know, and let's start talking about it. If you disagree with what I say, I definitely want to hear your opinion on why you disagree with me, because I've been over this and over this and over this in my head for a while now, and I stand by everything I just told you. There really, really is no good Dungeons & Dragons board game currently sold that captures the heart and the feel of what Dungeons & Dragons is supposed to be. So, I'm your buddy Big Johnny G of Two Gun Pixie Legendary Gaming Presents, and I want to hear what you have to say. I am out of here.